In October of 1722, the Shah of Persia walked out of the gates of his capital city personally, removed the crown from his own head, and placed it on the head of the man who had come to take it. The man receiving the crown was Mahmud Hotaki, the son of a semi-nomadic tribal chieftain from the hills around Kandahar. Mahmud was not the king of a great empire. He was not the general of a sophisticated military power. He was the leader of roughly 20,000 Pashtun tribesmen who had spent their lives herding animals in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, and he had just conquered the most sophisticated empire in the Middle East. The empire he had conquered was the Safavid Dynasty, 220 years old, builder of one of the most beautiful cities in human history, the power that had imposed Shia Islam on an entire civilization and held off the Ottoman Empire for 2 centuries. The Safavids had courtiers who dressed in silk worth more than villages. They had an imperial treasury that staggered the imagination of every ambassador who saw it. They had an army of tens of thousands. And in the spring and summer of 1722, that army had been completely destroyed by a force of Afghan shepherds and herdsmen who had never built a city in their lives and had no intention of starting. The story of how this happened is not really a story about Afghan military genius, though the Ghilzai Pashtun fighters were formidable. It is a story about what happens to an empire when its leaders stop paying attention to reality, when they surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear, when they mistake the beauty of their palaces for the strength of their foundations. The Safavid Empire did not fall because Afghanistan became powerful. It fell because Persia had quietly, gradually, over nearly a century, forgotten how to defend itself. The Safavid dynasty began in 1501 with one of history's most extraordinary teenagers. Shah Ismail I was 14 years old when he led his tribal followers, the Qizilbash, red heads, named for their distinctive crimson turbans, to victory over the Ak-Koyunlu Confederation at the Battle of Shurur. He then did something that no Persian ruler had done for 800 years. He declared himself Shah of all Iran, and he immediately declared that the state religion of Persia across the entire country would henceforth be Shia Islam. This was a revolutionary act. The vast majority of Persia's population was Sunni. Ismail enforced the conversion at sword point. Shia scholars were brought from Lebanon and Iraq. There were not enough in Persia to staff the new religious establishment. Sunni clergy who refused to convert were executed. The Sunni population that submitted was gradually, over generations, converted. What Ismail created was not just a new dynasty, but a new Persian identity. Shia Islam became inseparable from Persian national consciousness in a way that has lasted to the present day. The conversion also created an enemy. To the west, the Ottoman Empire was the dominant Sunni power in the Islamic world, and the Ottomans viewed Safavid Shia Persia as heretical. The result was a rivalry that produced a dozen major wars over 2 centuries, consuming vast resources and manpower on both sides. At various points, the Ottomans captured Baghdad, Tabriz, and deep into Persian territory. At other points, the Persians pushed back. The frontier between them shifted repeatedly. Neither side could permanently destroy the other. The dynasty's high point arrived with Shah Abbas I, Abbas the Great, who came to the throne in 1587 and ruled until 1629. Abbas inherited a dynasty in crisis, surrounded by enemies and internally divided. He spent the first years of his reign making painful peace deals to buy time, then systematically dismantled every weakness and rebuilt from the foundation. His military reform was the most important. He replaced the unreliable tribal cavalry, who fought when they wanted to and went home when they felt like it, with a disciplined standing army of ghulam, slave soldiers taken from Christian communities in Georgia and Armenia, trained as professional infantry and artillery, loyal only to the Shah. With this new army, Abbas reconquered territory lost to the Ottomans and the Uzbeks and turned Persia into the dominant military power of the region. He then turned his attention to Isfahan, which he made his capital and transformed into one of the most magnificent cities in the world. The centerpiece was the Naqsh-e-Jahan Square, image of the world, a public space covering nearly 20 acres surrounded by the Ali Kapu Palace, the Sheikh Lotfola Mosque, the Imam Mosque, and bazaars stretching in every direction. European travelers who visited said there was nothing like it on earth. The saying went, Isfahan Nesf-e-Jahan. Isfahan is half the world. Abbas also made Persia fabulously wealthy through the silk trade. Persian silk was among the finest in the world. Abbas expelled the Ottoman middlemen from the trade routes and established direct commercial connections with European powers. English, Dutch, and Portuguese merchants who were eager to buy Persian silk and sell Persian carpets. Isfahan became not just a political capital, but a global commercial hub. At its peak, the city held perhaps 500,000 people, larger than London or Paris at the same period. Abbas died in 1629, leaving Persia at the height of its power and prestige. The problem was succession. Abbas, terrified of threats from within his own family, as his own father had been killed by Qizilbash supporters of a rival, blinded or killed his most capable sons and grandsons. The successors who followed him lacked his ability, his drive, and his willingness to do the hard and unpleasant work of actual governance. Shah Safi, Shah Abbas II, Shah Suleiman, each ruled without particular distinction, allowing the court to become gradually more dominated by harem politics, religious clergy, and the same tribal forces that Abbas I had worked so hard to diminish. The military reforms eroded. The Ghulam armies became less disciplined. The tax system became more corrupt. The man who inherited this declining empire in 1694 was Shah Sultan Hussein, and he was precisely the wrong man for the job. Sultan Hussein was deeply, sincerely pious in a way that made him incapable of effective governance. He delegated everything to the Shia clergy, who used their influence to pursue theological enemies, particularly Sufi orders, Sunni communities, and religious minorities. He spent more time in the harem than in council. He did not travel, did not inspect his armies, did not receive foreign ambassadors with any real attention. He was known sarcastically as Mullah Hussein, the Shah who was more interested in being a cleric than a king. The policies of Sultan Hussein's court toward religious minorities were particularly destructive. The Shia clergy pushed an increasingly aggressive program of suppression against Sunni communities throughout the empire. In the Kandahar region, a borderland between the Safavid and Mughal empires where the Ghilzai Pashtuns lived, the Safavid governor Gurjan Khan enforced these policies with particular brutality. Gurjan Khan was a Georgian Christian who served the Safavids as a military commander and administrator. He was efficient and ruthless. He extracted taxes from the Ghilzai at rates they could not sustain, and he dismissed their complaints with contempt. The man who felt this most acutely was Mir Wais Hotak, the chief of the Hotaki clan of the Ghilzai Pashtuns. Mir Wais was an unusual figure in his world, politically sophisticated, personally charismatic, deeply respected by the tribal confederation he led. He was not a simple warrior. He understood that naked rebellion against the Safavid Empire without legitimacy would fail. So before he acted, he made a journey to Mecca. While there, he presented his situation to the Grand Mufti, the chief Sunni religious authority, and obtained a fatwa, a formal religious ruling that the Ghilzai Pashtuns, as Sunni Muslims, were not obligated to submit to Shia Persian rule and had the right to resist it. Armed with this religious authorization, Mir Wais returned to Kandahar and began preparing. In 1709, he invited Gurjan Khan, the despised Safavid governor, to a feast. At the feast, Mir Wais and his men killed Gurjan Khan and the Persian escort. He then organized the Ghilzai tribal confederation for war. When the Safavids sent an army from Isfahan to retake Kandahar, the first response, and the second, and the third, Mir Wais's forces defeated them each time. The Kandahar region became effectively independent. Mir Wais did not call himself a conqueror. He called himself a defender of his faith and his people. The court in Isfahan did not take this seriously enough. The Safavid perspective on the Ghilzai was condescending. They were tribesmen, herdsmen, unsophisticated people from a peripheral region. They had been subjects for generations. Surely they would eventually be brought back into line by a sufficiently large military expedition. This condescension was fatal. The expeditions that were sent were not large enough, not led well enough, and arrived with the assumption of easy victory, which made them brittle when they met determined resistance. Mir Wais ruled Kandahar independently until his death in 1715, having never been reconquered. After Mir Wais died, his brother Abdulaziz took over and immediately tried to make peace with the Safavids. Abdulaziz understood that holding Kandahar indefinitely against the full attention of the Persian Empire was not sustainable. He wanted a deal. His nephew Mahmud, Mir Wais's son, saw this as cowardice and betrayal. Mahmud killed his uncle and took control of the Hotaki Confederation. He had no interest in a negotiated return to Safavid rule. He had a more ambitious idea. If Persia was as weak as these repeated failed expeditions suggested, why stop at defending Kandahar? Why not take Persia itself? In 1719 and 1721, Mahmud led Afghan raiding forces deep into Persia, into the province of Kerman, testing the defenses, seeing how the Safavid forces responded, and gathering intelligence. What he found confirmed his assessment. The Safavid military was hollow. Commanders who had never fought a serious battle led troops who had no reason to fight loyally for a shah who did not know their names. In early 1722, Mahmud assembled his full force, approximately 20,000 horsemen and warriors, and marched west. He was not raiding anymore. He was invading. The Safavid court received increasingly alarming reports of the Afghan advance throughout the early months of 1722. The Shah convened councils. Plans were made. A large army was assembled. Estimates range from 35 to 42,000 men, with artillery. On paper, this force was twice the size of the Afghan army and far better equipped. On paper, it should have won easily. On the 8th of March, 1722, the two armies met near the village of Gulnabad, less than 30 miles from Isfahan. The Battle of Gulnabad was over in a few hours. The Safavid artillery, which should have been decisive, failed to function effectively. The gunners were poorly trained, and the guns were not positioned to cover the Afghan advance. When the Afghan cavalry swept around the flanks, the Persian infantry broke. Unit after unit routed without fighting seriously. The tribal cavalry contingents that formed the bulk of the Persian army had no loyalty to the Shah beyond what they were paid, and when payment seemed less certain than survival, they chose survival. The Afghan force lost relatively few men. The Safavid army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Mahmud Hotaki arrived at the walls of Isfahan on the 12th of March, 1722. He had 20,000 men. Inside the walls was a city of perhaps 500,000 people, with the Shah, the court, the treasury, and whatever armed men had survived Gulnabad. Mahmud could not storm the city. The walls were strong, and he did not have siege equipment for that kind of assault, so he did something more patient. He cut off the food supply. Every road leading into Isfahan was blocked by Afghan detachments. The city was sealed. The siege lasted 6 months. Inside Isfahan, the population gradually starved. The Shah sent desperate messages to the Ottoman Empire asking for military intervention. None came. The Ottomans were happy to watch Persia collapse. He called on the tribes of Persia to rally to him. Some did, but they were defeated piecemeal by the Afghans before they could combine into a force large enough to matter. A relief army of 30,000 Persians assembled and marched toward the city, but was defeated by a smaller Afghan force at the Battle of Fathabad in September. Inside the city, the situation became desperate. The price of bread rose to hundreds of times its normal level. People ate cats, dogs, and leather. The clergy and nobility urged the Shah to fight, to flee, to do something. But Sultan Hussein seemed paralyzed. He had never faced a crisis of this magnitude and had no mental framework for it. He prayed. He consulted astrologers. He held councils that produced no decisions. The city starved around him while he sat in his palace trying to understand how this could have happened to the heir of Abbas the Great. On the 23rd of October, 1722, Shah Sultan Hussein made his decision. He dressed in his finest robes, gathered the symbols of Safavid sovereignty, crown, sword, and signet, and rode out of the gates of Isfahan to the Afghan camp. He dismounted in front of Mahmud Hotaki. He removed the crown from his own head. He placed it on Mahmud's head with his own hands. He said, according to the sources, that God had given the kingdom to Mahmud and that he submitted to God's will. The surrender of 220 years of Persian imperial power took less than an afternoon. Mahmud Hotaki entered Isfahan as Shah of Persia. He was respectful of the city. No general massacre, no wholesale looting, no burning of the great mosques and palaces. He understood that he was now ruling something extraordinary and that destroying it would be stupid. He kept Sultan Hussein alive as a prisoner, treating him with some dignity. He tried to present himself not as a conqueror but as a new Shah, a legitimate ruler who had inherited power from a predecessor who had proven unworthy of it. This was more political sophistication than most observers expected from the son of a Kandahar chieftain. But consolidating power over all of Persia with 20,000 men was something else entirely. Persia was enormous, 100 times the size of the territory Mahmud had ever administered. Outside Isfahan, large portions of the country remained under the control of Safavid governors, regional strongmen, and tribal leaders who had not been defeated and had no intention of submitting to an Afghan king they considered a foreign invader. Mahmud's actual territorial control was limited to the area within a few days' ride of Isfahan. The rest of Persia continued much as before, waiting to see what happened. What happened was not reassuring. Mahmud's behavior and power became increasingly erratic. He was suspicious of everyone: Persian nobles, Safavid officials, even his own Afghan commanders. His suspicion was not entirely unreasonable. He was sitting in the middle of a potentially hostile capital with a small army in an enormous country that did not want him there. But his response to this situation was not statecraft. It was paranoia and violence. He began executing perceived opponents on little evidence. He became difficult for his own men to approach. In 1725, Mahmud's mental state broke completely. He ordered a massacre of the Safavid princes, the surviving male members of the royal family who were being kept as prisoners. On a single day, somewhere between 100 and several hundred people were killed. Then he ordered a massacre of Persian nobles and officers who had submitted to him. His own Afghan commanders watched in horror. Some tried to intervene and were threatened. Mahmud had gone from a conquering Shah to a man clearly suffering from a profound mental collapse, possibly triggered by the impossible weight of ruling something he had no framework to govern. In February of 1725, barely 2.5 years after his greatest triumph, Mahmud was killed by his own cousin Ashraf Khan Hotaki. Ashraf was a more stable personality and a more capable politician. He released many of the surviving prisoners, executed Mahmud's most notorious collaborators, and tried to present himself as a legitimate and reasonable ruler. He even defeated an Ottoman invasion in 1726 and signed a peace treaty in which the Ottomans recognized him as Shah of Persia, a diplomatic achievement that Mahmud had never managed. For a moment, the Hotaki dynasty looked like it might actually stabilize. But the savior Persia had been waiting for was already rising in the northeast. His name was Nader Koli Beg, later known as Nadir Shah, the Napoleon of Persia. He was a Turkic Afshar tribesman from Khorasan, northeastern Persia. Poor, tough, self-educated in the arts of war through decades of fighting in the chaotic Persian borderlands, he had risen to prominence by fighting on behalf of the surviving Safavid pretenders, presenting himself not as a rebel but as the restorer of Persian order. By 1729, he had an army, a strategy, and the momentum of a man who had been winning every battle he fought. In the autumn of 1729, Nader Shah met Ashraf Hotaki's forces at the Battle of Damgan. Ashraf had a larger force and the advantage of holding Persia's central territory. It made no difference. Nader was a military genius of the first order, the kind of commander who saw the battlefield differently from everyone around him and exploited weaknesses his opponents did not know they had. The Hotaki force was defeated and scattered. 6 weeks later, Nader defeated the remaining Afghan forces at the Battle of Mirchakhur. Ashraf fled southeast toward Kandahar. He was killed somewhere along the way, probably by Baluch tribesmen. Nader Shah entered Isfahan in the winter of 1729, 7 years after Mahmud Hotaki had received the Safavid crown there. He formally restored the Safavid dynasty, placing a young Safavid prince on the throne as Shah Abbas II. But everyone understood who actually held power. Nader was the military commander, the effective ruler, the man who had saved Persia. The restored Safavid Shah was a figurehead whose role was to provide Nader with legitimacy while Nader built his power further. It was a temporary arrangement. Nader Shah would eventually dispense with it entirely. In 1736, Nader Shah deposed the last Safavid Shah, declared himself ruler of Persia, and founded the Afsharid dynasty. He then did something that shocked the Islamic world. He announced that Persia would abandon Shia Islam as a state religion and return to a version of Sunni practice, or at least a non-sectarian form of Islam that did not antagonize Sunni neighbors. This was his attempt to end the endless wars with the Ottomans and present himself as a ruler of all Muslims rather than a sectarian champion. The Persian religious establishment resisted. The Ottoman Empire was skeptical. The policy was never fully implemented. What Nader did do, with overwhelming success, was conquer. He expelled the Ottomans from Persian territories they had occupied during the chaos. He pushed into the Mughal Empire of India, which was itself in decline, and in 1739 sacked Delhi, the Mughal capital. The sack of Delhi was one of the richest acts of pillage in history. Nader's forces took the Mughal treasury, the Peacock Throne, the great golden throne of the Mughals, which had itself been built on plunder from earlier conquests, and the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Nader returned to Persia so loaded with Indian wealth that he suspended taxation in Persia for 3 years. The story of what happened to the Safavid dynasty and what came after illuminates something important about how empires work and how they fail. Shah Abbas I understood this perfectly. An empire's strength is not its palaces or its treasury or the beauty of its mosques. Its strength is in the quality of its fighting men, the loyalty of its governors, and the competence of its leadership. Abbas built all three. His successors let all three erode while living in the palace he built. And the palace remained beautiful right up until the moment the Afghans arrived at its gates. The Ghilzai Pashtuns who conquered Persia were not uniquely powerful. They were roughly as capable as Pashtun tribal forces had always been. Good cavalry, strong tribal cohesion, effective in the kind of mobile warfare they had practiced for generations. What made them capable of conquering an empire was not that they got stronger. It was that the empire they faced had gotten dramatically weaker. The ratio had changed, not because one side improved, but because the other declined. The Safavid court had been practicing a century-long experiment in what happens when a great power stops paying attention to the things that made it great. The religious dimension of the Afghan conquest is important and often overlooked. Mir Wais Hotak's decision to obtain a fatwa from the Grand Mufti in Mecca before rebelling was a masterstroke. It framed the conflict not as tribal uprising or banditry, which could be suppressed with enough force, but as a legitimate religious obligation. Sunni Muslims had the right, indeed the duty, to resist Shia Persian rule. This gave the rebellion a moral framework that made it more than just a Ghilzai grievance. It made it a cause, one that could attract sympathy and support from Sunni communities throughout the region. The brief Hotaki interlude in Persian history, 7 years from 1722 to 1729, left almost nothing permanent. The Hotaki rulers were too few, too alien, too consumed by internal conflict to build institutions or leave lasting marks on Persian culture. They are remembered in Persian history primarily as a trauma, the conquerors who ended the greatest Persian dynasty, who starved Isfahan, whose leader went mad and massacred prisoners. In Afghan history, Mir Wais Hotak and Mahmud Hotaki are national heroes, the founders of the first independent Afghan state, the men who proved that the Pashtun tribes could defeat an empire. The last Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, spent his final years in captivity under the Afghans, then was killed by order of Ashraf Hotaki in 1725 during the same paranoid purge that killed Mahmud's other prisoners. He was buried in Isfahan, not far from the magnificent mosques and palaces built by the ancestors who had made the dynasty great. The contrast between the city Shah Abbas had built and the circumstances of Sultan Hussein's end encapsulates the entire story of Safavid decline. Extraordinary creation followed by extraordinary failure to maintain what had been created. The Safavid dynasty officially ended not with Sultan Hussein's surrender, but with Nader Shah's declaration of the Afsharid dynasty in 1736. The last Safavid Shah Tahmasp III died in obscurity. The dynasty that Ismail I had built through religious revolution and military conquest, that Abbas I had elevated to greatness through military genius and architectural splendor, had run its course. 235 years from founding to final end. Of that span, the last century had been a long, slow decline. The Afghan conquest of 1722 was not the cause of the collapse. It was the consequence of a collapse that had been happening in slow motion for generations. In October of 1722, a man who herded animals in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan received the crown of one of the world's greatest empires from its last effective ruler. He held it for 2.5 years before going mad. His successor held it for 4 more years before being expelled by a Turkic tribesman from the northeast. The greatest empire in the Middle East had been toppled not by a rival great power, but by a cascade of failures. Military decay, religious alienation, leadership incompetence, and the fatal mistake of mistaking a beautiful capital for a strong one. The shepherds did not conquer Persia. Persia let itself be conquered. The shepherds just showed up to receive it.